we think of intelligence as a conscious, deliberate activity that follows the rules of logic. But much of our conscious life follows rules that are different from logic. Intuition, gut feelings. We have intuition about friends, sports, the right bank, and other dangerous things. We fall in love and we feel that the stock market is going up again. Can these intuitions lead us to better decisions? That seems naive, even ridiculous. If you open a book on good decision making, then you will read the following message. List all the alternatives, all the consequences, and weigh the alternatives with the probabilities and their utilities. And then you make your decision. And that's what I think most of you are doing. But very few people follow this scheme. Yeah. And even those who wrote these books don't. Yeah. A professor from New York, from the Columbia University in New York, once had an offer from a rival university, and he couldn't make up his mind whether to stay or leave or accept or reject. Finally, one of his colleagues took him aside and asked, "What is your problem? Just maximize your expected utility. That is what you always tell your students." Exasperated, the professor replied, "Come on, this is serious." Yeah. Today, I want to invite you. Today, I want to invite you to a voyage in a largely unknown land, the land of intuition. And I will give you an example first, then define what intuition is, and then explain what science knows about how intuition works. Yeah. So we start our voyage at the international airport in Los Angeles. Are you ready? Good. Dan Horan is a police officer who works at the International Airport of Los Angeles. His task is to detect drug couriers. A drug courier is someone who flies into Los Angeles with a suitcase full of dollars and flies out a few hours later with the same suitcase full with drugs to be distributed in another American city. How to detect a drug courier among hundreds and thousands of people? That seems to be an impossible task. One evening, a plane from New York came in. A few hundred people descended, among them a woman with a rolling suitcase, the color that most of us chose, black. When her eyes met those of Dan Horan, everyone knew what the business of the others was. And both were right. A few minutes later, she was arrested. $200,000 were found in her suitcase, and she confessed. Yeah. I work with American judges and policemen, and I asked Dan Horan, how did you know that it's this woman and not anyone else in this huge airport? He said, I can tell it. I don't know it myself. I just see it. The only thing he could tell me was that he is looking for someone who is looking for him. Yeah. So here we have the very idea of intuition. An intuition is a judgment that has three properties. It quickly appears in consciousness. The underlying process is not known to the person, and nevertheless, it guides much of our decisions, everyday and professional. The case of the police officer also illustrates the difficulty our society has with intuitive decisions, even if they are brilliant. When a police officer arrests a drug courier and finds illegal drugs and maybe weapons, and the case gets to court, and the judge asks the police officer, why did you arrest this person? And he honestly says, I had a hunch. That doesn't count. According to American law, you have to have reasons first and then make a decision. Yeah. And it has happened that a case where illegal drugs and weapons were found, the entire case was dismissed because the police officer didn't have the conscious reasons first. Yeah. What has happened now is that the police officers deliver the reasons after the fact. They make them up. Yeah. So here's one situation where society deeply mistrusts of good intuitions. Yeah. And the consequence is that because not every intuition is good, the police officers cannot learn how to tell good from bad ones because they're not supposed to have any. Yeah. Somehow I think that Italian takes longer than English, so I make more breaks. So let's go on. There is a second enemy to good intuition, besides the American law. The second one is the association between intuition and women. What you see here is what the first president of the American Psychological Society about 100 years ago wrote. He says, she, that's all the women among you, she works by intuition and feeling. If she abandons her natural naivete and takes up the burden of guiding and accounting for her life by consciousness, she is likely to lose more than she gains. According to the old saw, that she who deliberates is lost. Yeah. You see this on TV every night in Italian TV. Women are supposed to be beautiful, but no brains. This is now politically incorrect. Yeah. But many psychologists and researchers now think that all intuitions are doubtful, even those of men. Yeah. By the way, we have little evidence that women actually have much better intuitions, but we also have little evidence that men can reason better than women. Yeah. So what we need is to go beyond the stereotypes and give intuition the place that it deserves. And in fact, it's not just women who have intuitions, but many intuitions in business, top professional decisions are made by gut feelings. That is, the manager or CEO has a feeling what to do, but he or she cannot explain why. What do you think? How many decisions in business, important decisions, are intuitive? That means that the decision maker cannot say how he did it. I show you here a study of a large company I worked with, and I interviewed the decision maker up to the top. How often do you make important decisions in an intuitive way? That is, you really can't say why. Huh? And as you see, through all the levels in the hierarchy, in about 50% of all cases, the decision is an intuitive one. But given the prejudices of our society against intuition, most of the decision makers don't admit it. And then they may do the gut decision, but hire, say, a consulting firm in order to find the reasons. Or the alternative is that they do not dare to go by their guts, but choose an option, a second or third best option, which they can defend, and which, if something goes wrong, protects them. How often is that the case? Here is a study, again, about a huge international firm, and the question is, how often do you make defensive decisions? That is, a decision that's not the best for your country, for your company, but one that protects you if something goes wrong. Yeah. And here you see there are some loyal people who never choose an option that protects them and hurts the company, but on average, 1 out of 3 of the decisions are defensive. Yeah. So here we have in our society a huge problem that good intuitions are not being trusted, and we waste time, money, and attention to look for reasons after the fact, or to actually take alternatives that are second and third best. So let's move on our voyage. What is not an intuitive decision? I show you here a letter from Benjamin Franklin to his nephew, and where he tells him how to make a decision under uncertainty. And what he tells you is the following. Take a sheet of paper, make a line, and list all reasons for and against. Then you weigh them, and you make the calculation. And then you go with the decision with the highest number. And note what he's saying in his last sentence. He says, I apprehend, if you don't learn it, I apprehend you will never be married. Is there anyone here who has chosen his wife, his husband or partner this way? Hands up. Nobody? Oh, one person, yeah. There's one honest woman, huh? Great, yeah. Whom did you find? So, yeah. There's actually a famous financial analyst, Meredith Whitney, who became famous because she made the calculations and got Citibank down a few years ago. And then she used the same algorithm to find a husband. Yeah. And she got a professional wrestler. Yeah. Now, I have asked many of my friends who defend this kind of decision theory, which is now in economics called expected utility maximization. So I asked these friends, economists, most of them are men, how did you choose your wife? And all of them said, no, I didn't do that. Yeah. And actually, in many real important decisions, people refrain from that. I should admit that I found one economist who said yes. I followed my theory. And he explained to me that he listed all the alternatives, all the consequences. For instance, will she take care of the children? Will she let me work in peace? And then he put weights on that, and he made the calculation, and he proposed to the women with the highest expected utility. She accepted. He did not tell her how he did it. I met him a year ago, now they are divorced. Yeah. But the point is not that I want to say that deliberate reasoning is bad and intuition is good or the versa. The important point is that we learn to ask the question, in what situation should I trust my intuition and when not? Yeah. And in order to understand this, we need to understand how intuition works. And there are basically three ideas. The first one is the one widespread in the cognitive sciences, in economics, in behavioral economics. And the idea is that intuition are basically something second-class biases, which, as we know, women have, and others. I will show you that this is a wrong idea. The second interpretation is that intuition, since it is often good, must do the same thing as Benjamin Franklin's calculus. Do lots of calculations in the unconscious. I will, by means of examples, also show you that this is not the case. But surprisingly, we find that good intuitions often are based on what we call fast and frugal heuristics. That is, simple rules that focus on the most important and ignore the rest. I will show you now a few examples how this works. And I begin with an example how your brain makes smart inferences in a way you do not understand. So, look at this. What do you see here? You see dots which are concave. They go into the surface, and those who are convex, they come out. Okay? No doubt. Okay, now fixate one of these points here. Okay, get it? And watch what you see. What you will see is that it will pop out at some point. Okay. Ready? Now it's coming. Now you should have seen it. So what does your brain make with you? As you know, I can show you it again very shortly. Fixate a point here, and it's changed. So, what your brain does, it uses unconscious intelligence. You don't know how it works. And we can identify how this works. There's nothing complex calculated. It's based on a simple heuristic. That's it. So our brain has had an evolutionary development. And most of the time humans lived, light came from above. Yeah? And there was only one source of light. And this is what your brain assumes and knows. And it uses a simple rule to infer from the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional, which is, if the shade is in the upper part, then the dots are concave. And if the shade is in the lower part, they pop out. Because that would be if the light is coming from above. Yeah. And that's the basic way intuition works. It has smart rules that work most of the time and that are well adapted to the world. Okay, now we move on to sports. And I will show you how players solve problems without knowing, just like what you have seen before. Is there anyone here who plays baseball? No. Cricket? No. Soccer? Soccer? No? Oh, one, two, yeah, right. Okay. Okay, assume you would play sports. Huh? And a ball comes in high. And you want to catch it. Huh? Yeah. an experienced player knows immediately where to run to catch the ball. How does he know it? If you interview a player, you get the same answer as the policeman there in Huran. He doesn't know. Yeah. Have you ever interviewed a soccer player? Good luck. So there are now two theories. One is good intuition is based on complex calculations. So basically to calculate the trajectory of the ball and to run where it comes down. What else could it be? And that's what Richard Dawkins, for instance, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, tells us. So if you run where to catch a ball, you solve differential equations in your mind somehow, even if you don't know what it is. Yeah? Your unconscious does it. Yeah. And he feels that it just can't be, so he puts in the term as if, so people behave as if. Yeah? And then the usual, and then he says something functionally equivalent will go on. Yeah? That's the hand waving something. Yeah? This is a typical model that you find in economics. People behave as if they would be maximize something. I show you now that what the player does has nothing to do with calculating a trajectory, but using a simple intuitive rule. Yeah. By the way, has any one of you ever calculated a trajectory? So in theory, balls fly in parabolas. So you would need to estimate the initial distance, velocity, and the angle with which the ball is thrown or kicked. But in practice, balls do not fly in parabolas because there's wind and air resistance. So you would have to estimate the direction of the wind and the intensity on each point of the flight, and there's spin. So how should that work? Yeah. Now, experiments have shown that experienced players use a very simple rule. It's called the Gaze Heuristic. This is the simplest one. This one, there are several of these rules. This one is the simplest one, which works when the ball is already high up in the air. It has 3 steps. First, fixate your eye on the ball. Second, start running. Third, adjust your running speed so that the angle of gaze remains constant. This player here, which I show you, will keep the angle constant. Just watch that. Do you want to see it again? So he ends up where the ball is. And the important thing is that the player can ignore all the information necessary to calculate the trajectory and pay attention only to one information, that's the angle of gaze. So here we have another illustration that we can identify how intuitive decisions work. And they are amazingly simple. And at the same time, better than doing these calculations. But even if you could, you probably put in some error and end up somewhere where the ball is not. The Gaze Heuristic is not just useful for playing ball. It is used by many animals to catch prey or for mating. So if you happen to have a dog at home and throw a frisbee, the dog will do the same thing. Yeah? It keeps the eyes on the frisbee and runs. So the optical thing. Another example is the miracle on the Hudson River. Remember US Airways flight 1549? The pilots had to make a quick decision whether to try to land on LaGuardia Airport. And they had to figure out whether they make it or not. How do you do that? And they used the same heuristic. They didn't do any calculations. And the co-pilot, Jeffrey Skiles, explains it exactly how he did it. And when you see here what he said it's not mathematical calculation, it's just visual. So you just look at the airport, and if the airport goes up in your windshield, you will not make it. If it's constant or you go after it, you'll make it. So these are examples where intuitive decisions are made with very simple and robust heuristics. So let's move on our voyage. Assume you have too much money and you want to invest it. And there's a number of options. And the question is, how much in which of these options? That's a typical decision. How do you make it? Now, one option, so one of my postdoc studies how decisions are made in Italian banks. And here it often is just that the customer defers the decision to the advisor. Yeah. Not realizing that the advisor will sell you where the bank gets the highest percentage. Okay, now let's go back to this question. How to invest? Harry Markowitz got his Nobel Prize for finding the optimal solution to this problem. It is called the so-called mean variance model or portfolio. In simple terms, you maximize the mean, the gain, and minimize the variance, the risk. Yeah. That's taught to every student of finance. So far so good. When Harry Markowitz made his own decisions, his own investments for the time after his retirement, then he used his Nobel Prize winning optimization theory. So we might think. No, he did not. He used a very simple intuition. He used a simple intuition which is called 1 divided by n, which is the number of options you have. Just divide equally. So if you have 2 alternatives, 50-50, 3, a third, and so on. Now, why did he not follow his own theory? Yeah. The reason is probably because he understood better than many others about the limitations of finance theory. I mean, now it should be obvious to everyone, yeah, after the crash, that this theory is not better than a simple intuitions. Now the important question is, how good is this intuition? And a number of studies done in the UK and also in my institute showed that when you test this, a very surprising result comes out. So one takes, for instance, 10 American industry funds and takes a, so since the mean variance model needs to estimate its parameters, it needs to 10 years of stock data to learn, and then it predicts the next months. You move this a month and 10 years the next month until you run out of data. And then you can show what it does better. In one study where one had the Markowitz model and a dozen modern finance models, Bayesian, non-Bayesian, none of these fancy theories could outperform the simple intuitive strategy. Investing equal made more money than all these complex calculations. Now, the important question now is, when does this intuition work, and when would performing all these calculations pay out? Here are three features when the intuition will be better than the complex calculations. The first one is when the predictive uncertainty is large, which is the case in the stock market. When the number of alternatives is large. And third, when the learning sample, so the data you have, is small. In this experiment, the data were 10 years. So, what do you think? How many years of stock data would one need so that the complex computations of the Markowitz model would actually be better than this simple intuition? 10 years is too little. What do you think? How many? No, 11 years? No, 500 years. That means in the year 2500, you can switch, if you're still alive, to doing these complex calculations, assuming that the same stocks are still around and the stock market in the first place. So, do banks understand this? In my experience, very few. What you see here is, for those of you who can read German, I'm coming from Berlin. This is my internet bank who sent around this letter with Nobel Prize winning strategy to success in investment. And then you read, do you know Harry Markowitz? No, you should. And the story is being told that he has developed the optimal asset investment method, and the bank now adopts it, and there's a warning against your intuitions. What this bank has not understood is that it sent the letter 500 years too early. Okay. So, I give you another example very briefly. Assume you have a large company which sells clothes or anything else, and you have 100,000 customers, and you don't want to send your catalogs to those who will never buy. So the question is how to tell active from non-active customers. And here we have the same two worlds. One is to use a complex calculations. For instance, in management theory, it's called a Pareto negative binomial distribution model. Don't worry what it means. And on the other hand, experienced managers do not use these models, but use simple intuitions. In one study, they used a simple intuition. If a customer hasn't bought for 9 months, out, otherwise in. Yeah. How good is that? In our society, most would say, you shouldn't do that. You should also consider not just how long the customer hasn't bought, how much he has bought, what spacing, and so on. And what you do is irrational. The answer is, don't believe that. Intuitions are often very good, and you need to test that. I'll show you now the results of 3 studies. And here you have the intuition. It's called hiatus heuristic. So 9 months, just that, nothing else. And the complex calculations of the Pareto MBD model. And these are the correct predictions. The higher, the better. And you see, the intuition for the airline does better, identifies more correctly which customer will buy and not, than the complex calculations. The same for the apparel business, and for the CD business, it's the same. You just save all the effort of doing these computations that lead to nothing. So, let me now summarize what I've said so far. There are 3 basic misconceptions that you will find in our society and maybe also in your own minds. And certainly in all textbooks in psychology, economics, and elsewhere. The first misconception is intuition produces second-best results. Optimization and complex calculations are always better. No. Don't believe that. The question is, when is it better, when not? And I've given you a few examples for that. The second misconception is that intuition relies on these simple rules that we call heuristics just because our minds are so limited. That's also wrong. For instance, Harry Markowitz could easily have calculated his theory, but he was better off not doing it. And third, more information is not always better, more computation is not always better, and more time is not always better. I gave you illustrations for information and computation, but I haven't talked about time. Let me give you an example from... Okay, is anyone here who plays golf? No. Okay. Assume you would play golf. We have 2 groups of golf players, experienced ones, experts, and novices, those who just learn. And now you give each group only 3 seconds to make the so-called putt. What will happen? Let's start with the beginners. when the beginners have only 3 seconds, do they get better or worse? Who thinks they get better? 1, 2, 3, 4, lots, yeah. Just there. Don't relax. Who thinks they get worse? Yeah, slightly more. You're getting it. You're getting at it. The beginner, when the beginner has less time, the beginner gets worse on average. A beginner needs time, needs to think about things. It's like piano playing, you need time. What happens with the expert golf players? When expert golf players get only 3 seconds to make the putt, do they get better or worse? Who thinks the experts get better? Hands up. The experts get better. Who thinks the experts get worse when they have only 3 seconds? Okay, I'm very happy. Most of you got it. An expert who has less time gets better. Why is this? Having less time keeps experts from thinking about what they're doing. Their knowledge is in the unconscious. But it helps beginners. So let's try this again, yeah? So that I make sure that every one of you gets it. Same experiment, beginners and experts. Now we instruct them to pay attention to the movements, to their swing, okay? When we instruct beginners to pay carefully attention to what they're doing, do they get better or worse? Who thinks they get better? The beginners. Good. Who thinks they get worse? Okay, we need to practice a little bit. So, most of you get it. A beginner who pays attention to what he's doing will get better. A beginner needs everything. That's like how you learn piano or to do a tie or whatever. Now, the experts. When we tell experts, pay attention to what you're doing, will the expert get better or worse? Who thinks the experts get better? Okay, so who thinks the experts get better? Who thinks the experts get worse when they pay attention to what you're doing? Okay, now we got it. Yeah, got it. I'm glad. So the general point is, much of expertise, from Den Huran to the sports, is in the unconscious. And everything that you can do to keep your consciousness away helps. So now you also know how to use this in a strategic way. Assume you would play tennis, and your opponent has this forehand today that hits you on the wall. Now you know what to do. When you change sides and he passes by, you ask him, you have this strong forehand today. How do you do it? And there is a good chance that he starts to think. And the problem is solved. So the last thing I do with you is to just introduce you a bit to the underlying research and the reasons why very often less can be more. And that's one of the key messages of this study of intuition, that the art is to focus on the important and ignore everything else. So we do this with scientific methods, and I just go with one slide. If it's too complex, then just look away. So what you see here is a summary of 20 studies where you predict everything from dropout rates in schools to economic and psychological variables. The very point is the following. There is a very simple heuristic called take the best. It's just much what I've showed before. It just relies on one good reason to make a decision. Take the best, ignore the rest. There's a second heuristic that we just saw, telling that's 1 by n, weigh everything equally. And here we have a complex optimization model, multiple regression, that's used in economics, in psychology, everywhere. And then we have an intuition that is too simple. It just takes, it's like randomness. It just takes anything. Yeah. Now you see two things. This is the accuracy in the prediction. So you want to predict, for instance, which of two schools has a higher dropout rate in Chicago. And here we have fitting. Fitting means you know everything. You know all the data. That's certainty. And then you do your calculations. And in this situation, where you know everything already, hindsight, the complex method does best. Yeah. But if you need to make predictions, if you don't know everything already, then all of this change. You see the crossover? All the simple heuristics turn out to be better, to these two, than the complex method. The difference is something like in Berlin, I hear every morning an interview with a financial expert. And he is asked, why did Siemens go down yesterday? And he always has an answer. This is called hindsight. You know it already. If the financial analyst would be asked, will Siemens go up or down tomorrow? That's prediction. And predicting the future is hard. And this is an important distinction because many complex models are sold to you and to banks based on just hindsight, data fitting. Okay, that's the science part. So let's summarize what we did. How can we make better decisions? One intuitive strategy is to rely on just one good reason and ignore the rest. You've seen a few examples. And we understand in what world this works and where not. Second, another principle is fast decisions are often better than long deliberation. And the examples with sports have illustrated that. A third important insight is that much in our world, in the political world, in the business world, and also when you go to your doctor, is about defensive decisions. Just like in the beginning I explained with this company. A defensive decision is, again, that the decision maker doesn't recommend to you the best option, but a second or third best that protects him or her. For instance, many doctors fear to be sued by their patient when something goes wrong. Much more in the US than in Italy. But you may also eventually get in this climate of litigation. As a consequence, in the US, doctors recommend to their patients unnecessary treatments, unnecessary diagnostics, such as computed tomography, MRIs, biopsies, and so on. But the doctor has little choice because he needs to protect himself against you. I work with doctors, and many tell me, I know quickly what's wrong with the patient, that's the intuition, but I have to do all these tests just if something goes wrong to show that I did these tests. It's the same situation as with the drug couriers, the same situation as we have seen in many areas of our society. An important thing is to design a society that makes good decisions and not defensive decisions. For instance, many politicians in all over Europe do not dare anymore to make decisions. Because if something could wrong, they would be responsible. And one hires consulting firms and others and outsources the authorities and the decisions. Next, it's very important to look for strategies that are robust and mistrust many optimizing strategies. And the financial crisis is a good example for that. And finally, the art of intuition is also the art of ignoring information, not collecting more. And in general, if you make decisions under uncertainty, we need to ignore part of the information. So let me conclude. I introduced you today to the science of intuition. It is a largely unknown world because almost everyone is suspicious of it. I defined what intuition is. It's quick in consciousness, the underlying processes we are not aware of, but it guides much of our action. The unconscious processes are not collecting information, but it's based on smart, simple rules. And I've shown, giving you an example, that good intuitions can outperform the most sophisticated statistical software packages. And at the end, more time, more information, more computation is not always better. I hope that this voyage into the world of intuition showed you that there are many good reasons to trust your gut feelings. Thank you.